She was invisible in their eyes, but soon she would be unforgettable. The night was bitterly cold. Snow pressed against the window panes, and the wind howled like a warning outside. Inside the grand house, warmth and laughter filled every corner, but not for her. Down on her knees on the hard wooden floor, the maid scrubbed until her hands were raw, red, and trembling. Her back ached, her knees bruised, but no one noticed. No one ever did. She was the ghost of the house, moving quietly from room to room. Plates cleared, floors polished, clothes folded, and yet, to the family she served, she was nothing more than furniture. A shadow, a pair of tired hands, someone whose name they barely remembered. The children tossed crumbs at her, laughing. The lady of the house wrinkled her nose at her clothes. The master barely looked in her direction, except to scold her for mistakes she never made. And every insult, every mocking glance sank deeper into her soul. But what they didn't know was this: every cruel word, every careless act of cruelty was writing their own downfall. Late at night, when the house grew silent and their laughter faded into sleep, she curled into her thin blanket in the attic. She cried softly, her face buried in the pillow, whispering prayers into the darkness. Lord, give me strength. Help me endure. Help me find justice. Her voice trembled, but her heart longed for something more than survival. She longed for dignity, for fairness, for someone to see her not as a maid, not as a servant, but as a human being. Yet no one came. Her prayers echoed back unanswered, or so it seemed. And still, she kept whispering them, night after night, her tears soaking the sheets until they were stiff with salt. Her days were endless cycles of labor and humiliation. If she slowed for even a moment, a harsh voice would rise. If she dared to look tired, they would laugh. If she looked too sad, they would accuse her of being ungrateful. And yet, she kept working, quiet, patient, humble, because that was all she knew. But something was building inside her. A storm. At first, it was just a flicker, a fleeting thought in the quiet of night. A whisper in her mind asking, how much longer? The more they hurt her, the louder that whisper grew, until one day it would no longer be a whisper. And when that day came, she would not cry in silence. She would not bow her head. She would rise, and the world that mocked her would never laugh again. Her story is not one of weakness. It is not one of defeat. It is the story of a woman the world underestimated. A woman who learned that sometimes prayers are answered in ways no one expects. And when her revenge came, it did not just silence them. It shocked everyone who thought they knew her. This is her story. But before we begin, if you love powerful payback stories like this, where betrayal turns into justice and silence becomes strength, make sure you subscribe now to Payback Stories. Because here, every tale reminds us, no matter how invisible someone may seem, no one stays invisible forever. The day for her began long before the family even stirred from their beds. While the sky was still dark, when the air outside bit with the chill of dawn, she was already awake. Her hands, still sore from yesterday's work, reached for the cold basin of water in her tiny attic room. The attic wasn't really a room. It was more like a storage corner. The ceiling slanted low, so she could barely stand without bowing her head. The single window was cracked and drafty, letting the winter air seep in. Her blanket was thin, her mattress older than she was. And yet, this was where she rested her weary body every night. She rose quietly, careful not to make a sound. Even her footsteps seemed to apologize. By the time the first light stretched across the horizon, she was already in the kitchen, hands deep in flour, preparing bread that she herself would never taste. The family never saw those early hours. They never saw her fingers cracked from kneading, or the way she held back a wince when hot pans burned her palms. They only saw the table filled with food, steaming and ready, as though it had appeared by magic. When the children stumbled downstairs, rubbing sleep from their eyes, their laughter filled the air. She greeted them softly, a smile on her face, though her heart was heavy. She set their plates down carefully, never daring to sit, never daring to rest. And yet, her kindness was met with cruelty. One child, spoiled by comfort, would crumple a piece of bread and toss it at her. "Here, maid, you eat this. It's all you deserve." He'd laugh. She would lower her eyes, pick up the crumbs, and carry on. The lady of the house was no better. Elegant dresses, sparkling jewels, she was a woman who lived to be admired. And part of her admiration came from belittling others. The maids. Shoes, worn thin with holes in the soles, became her favorite target. "My goodness," she'd sneer, lifting her chin. "Even beggars in the street have better shoes than that." Then she'd laugh as if it were a joke. But it was never a joke to the one standing silently with flushed cheeks and trembling hands. This was her world. A grand house full of warmth, fine meals, and laughter, but none of it belonged to her. The chandeliers glowed, the fireplaces roared, and the walls echoed with joy, but she was not part of it. She was the shadow in the corner, the invisible figure keeping it all together. When guests visited, the cruelty deepened. They would speak of her as if she weren't in the room. "Oh, that's just the maid," they'd say, dismissing her existence with a wave of the hand. And if she faltered, if she spilled even a drop, she was scolded sharply, humiliated before strangers. Outside, the world carried on with its beauty. Birds sang in the morning. Flowers bloomed in the garden. The air smelled of life and promise, but inside her chest there was only heaviness. A loneliness so deep that sometimes she wondered if her life had been designed only for suffering. Yet through all of it, she carried herself with patience. She kept her head low, her voice soft, her steps gentle. And when the weight of the day crushed her spirit, she found herself whispering again to the heavens, to anyone who might listen. "Lord, give me strength. Maybe tomorrow they'll be kinder. Maybe one day they'll see me." She prayed not for wealth, not for comfort, not even for freedom. She prayed only for kindness, for a sliver of compassion in a world that treated her as nothing. But compassion never came. Every day the cycle repeated, rising before the sun, cleaning until her bones ached, serving those who ridiculed her, and retreating to her attic with tears she dared not shed in daylight. The family grew comfortable in their cruelty because to them her silence was weakness. They believed her patience meant she would endure forever, but silence has a breaking point. Patience has an end dot, and though they did not see it, though they could not hear it, something inside her was changing. A quiet fire was taking root where sorrow used to live. A fire they would one day regret igniting. At first, the maid thought she could endure it all. She told herself, if I just stay quiet, if I just do my work, they will leave me in peace. But the truth was crueler than she ever imagined. Her silence, instead of softening their hearts, gave them license to become even harsher. What began as mocking words soon turned into blame for every mishap in the house. One evening, the family gathered in the parlor, the fire crackling, golden light spilling across expensive rugs. Laughter filled the air as they entertained important guests. And then, suddenly, there was a crash. A priceless vase had fallen from its pedestal, shattering into sharp, glittering pieces. The room fell silent for a breath, and then all eyes turned toward her. She hadn't even been near it. She was in the kitchen when the sound rang out. Yet, when she entered the room, broom in hand, the lady of the house's voice pierced the air. "Of course it was you," she snapped, eyes sharp with disdain. "Who else would be so clumsy? Who else would destroy something so valuable?" The guests shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves. The master of the house stood tall, his voice booming with authority. "This maid has no respect for what is ours." Look at her, trembling like a thief caught in the act. Her heart pounded, her cheeks burned red with humiliation. Tears welled in her eyes as she tried to speak. I didn't," but her words were cut short. "Silence," the master barked, his voice echoing off the walls. "You will clean this mess, and perhaps next time you'll remember your place." The guests laughed nervously, trying to ease the tension, but the damage was already done. She knelt to the floor, her hands shaking as she gathered the shards. Each sharp edge bit into her skin, but the sting of glass was nothing compared to the sting of shame. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks, dripping onto the broken pieces as though even her sorrow was being swept away. That night, in the solitude of her attic, she cried harder than she had in weeks. Her pillow was damp, her voice hoarse from whispering her prayers. "Why, Lord? Why must I suffer for things I have not done?" But no answer came, only the cold wind whistling through the cracked window. The cruelty did not stop there. A missing coin purse, blamed on her. A meal not to the master's liking, her fault. A torn dress belonging to the lady. They accused her of jealousy. Day after day, she carried the weight of sins she had not committed. And though her lips remained sealed, inside her silence grew heavier, pressing against her chest like a stone. There were moments when she thought her heart might burst from the pressure. Standing in the dining hall, serving dishes with hands that shook, she felt the eyes of everyone on her, mocking, judging, waiting for her to falter. And falter she did. Not because she was careless, but because she was human. Her trembling hand once spilled water across the table. The master's face twisted with anger. In front of a room full of guests, he slammed his fist against the table. "Incompetent," he thundered. "A simple task, and you fail even at that. What use are you to anyone?" Her breath caught in her throat. Her knees went weak. She bowed her head, her tears falling freely now, splashing onto the floorboards. The laughter of guests zapped at her ears like knives. The humiliation carved deep scars in her soul. But where others saw weakness, something else was forming. Beneath the tears, beneath the shame, a quiet fire smoldered. The family believed her silence meant obedience, that her lowered eyes meant defeat. But they were wrong. Each insult, each false accusation, was building something they could not see. A storm waiting for release late at night. As she sat by the small attic window, staring at the stars beyond the cracked glass, her thoughts began to change. Once, she had prayed only for strength, but now, her prayers carried another weight. One day, she whispered, the truth will be known. One day, they will feel what I feel. One day, justice will come. And though her lips still stayed silent by day, her silence was no longer submission. It was patience. A patience that was running out, because betrayal has a way of pushing even the gentlest soul past its breaking point. And the maid was closer to that edge than anyone realized. There are moments in life that mark a before and an after. A single humiliation so sharp it cuts through the soul, leaving behind a scar that never fades. For the maid, that moment came on a night she would never forget. The house was alive with grandeur. Chandeliers blazed with light, their crystals scattering gold across the walls. Music filled the air, soft violins playing as wealthy guests laughed and sipped wine from delicate glasses. The scent of roasted meats and sweet desserts drifted through the halls. To the family, it was a night of pride, a display of wealth and status. But for her, it was another night of servitude. She carried trays heavier than her arms could bear, weaving silently between tables. Eyes downcast so no one would see the weariness etched into them. The lady of the house, glittering in silk, was entertaining her friends when she suddenly pointed at the maid. Her voice rang out, sharp and amused. "Look at her," she said, laughter in her tone. "Clumsy little thing, isn't she? Always stumbling, always in the way." The women tittered behind jeweled fans, their eyes darting toward the maid as though she were a creature on display. The maid's cheeks burned crimson, but she kept walking, tray steady, heart pounding. But then it happened. One of the children, emboldened by the laughter, reached out and deliberately struck the tray she was carrying. Plates clattered to the floor, food scattering across the polished wood. The room erupted and gasps stopped. The maid froze, hands trembling, eyes wide with shame. She dropped to her knees instantly, gathering the pieces with trembling fingers. Her breath came fast, her vision blurred with tears. And then, the master of the house's voice roared above her. "On your knees? Then stay there." He sneered, his words slicing through her dignity. "Since you love groveling so much, why don't you serve from the floor where you belong?" The guests laughed, not all of them comfortably, but laughter nonetheless. The lady of the house smirked, sipping her wine as though the humiliation unfolding before her was no more than a casual performance. The maid's heart broke in that instant, not because of the cruelty. She had grown used to that, but because of the betrayal. She had given them her loyalty, her hard work, her silence. She had bent herself into invisibility, hoping that obedience might one day earn her respect. But what had it earned her? Nothing but shame. Tears spilled freely now, rolling down her cheeks. Falling onto the floor, she scrubbed it daily until her knuckles bled. Her body trembled, but deep inside, something else stirred. Behind the tears, behind the humiliation, there was a spark. The guests may have thought they were seeing weakness, but what they were truly witnessing was the birth of something stronger than any of them could imagine. That night, long after the laughter had died down and the grand house had grown quiet, she lay in her attic bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. Her eyes burned, her body still ached from the weight of the trays, but her mind was sharper than it had ever been, and her prayers. Oh, her prayers had changed. No longer did she whisper for strength to endure. No longer did she beg for kindness from those who had none to give. That night, her prayers were different. "Lord," she whispered into the darkness, voice steady despite the tears, "do not give me strength to endure. Give me strength to rise. Give me justice. Let them taste the pain they gave me." Her voice no longer cracked with sorrow. It carried a new weight, a new edge. She was done begging for mercy, done waiting for compassion. This betrayal, this public spectacle that stripped away the last of her dignity, was the spark that lit the fire inside her. A fire that would burn quietly, carefully, until it was ready to consume everything they had built. She turned on her side, clutching her thin blanket, her eyes burning in the dark. And in that silence, something shifted. The maid who once cried into her pillow every night was gone. In her place stood a woman who would no longer be ignored. The family believed they had silenced her, crushed her beneath their laughter. But in truth, they had awakened her. Her silence was over, and soon, the very house that mocked her would tremble at the sound of her voice. After that night, when laughter had broken her and shame had hardened into something else, she stopped moving through the house like a ghost. She still wore the same plain dress. She still wiped tables and swept floors and answered the bell. But the way she held her head changed ever so slightly, not proud, not arrogant, only steady. Inside, where sorrow had lived, a careful mind began to work. She learned to think in the quiet between chores. In the small pauses while the roast bubbled or the children chased each other outdoors, she watched. She stopped looking as if she wanted to disappear and instead watched with small, careful eyes. The house that once felt like a prison became, piece by piece, her classroom. Every corridor, every locked drawer, every whispered conversation was a lesson. She kept her observations like seeds. A toss remark at the breakfast table. A hushed quarrel behind the closed study door. A ring of keys left carelessly on a sideboard. These were nothing to them, careless crumbs from their perfect lives. To her, they were clues. There were weaknesses, of course. People always had them. The master of the house was all thunder and no ballast. He loved his reputation more than truth. He snarled at the smallest inconvenience, but on certain nights, long after guests had gone, the housekeeper would tidy the study and find him staring at ledger pages that didn't add up. He kept late hours with men who spoke in numbers and promises. The lady of the house polished her hands while someone else polished her secrets. She drank to study the nights when guilt pressed too hard, and her laughter often covered up a tremor of fear at the sound of her husband's name on someone else's lips. The children, spoiled and careless, were mirrors for the family's rot. One of them had a cruel streak, throwing things, saying things he shouldn't, and another kept a box of paper dolls that, folded a certain way, hid notes from that awful night they had laughed together. The smallest ones had no idea their games were carving paths. The grown-ups would later need to hide. She listened without being seen. She heard the lady whisper to a friend about a deed, about moving money quietly out of the house to secure a life elsewhere. She heard the master berate a business partner in a tone that admitted guilt. There were names, dates, mentions of signatures signed when someone's back was turned. Once, passing the study, she caught the master picking up a pen and pretending to sign papers he hadn't read, a practice move. She memorized the way his hand trembled when he lied. Details collected like water in a basin. A stray envelope left under a cushion with the name of a bank she'd never heard of. A receipt from a small locksmith shop, late night work, 2 weeks ago. A hastily folded napkin with a scrawl, meet at the pier. Midnight. Each fragment was a note in a song she learned to read. She also learned about their habits. The lady always locked the drawer in the master's study with one specific key, kept on a hook behind the portrait of some distant ancestor. The master removed that key from the hook on Thursdays and put it in his coat pocket, while the house was busy with dinner and guests. The gardener left his tools out late on market day, and with a ladder and a borrowed excuse, the maid could be in the attic while everyone watched the music downstairs. She was careful. Patient didn't mean reckless. She did not grab or shout or threaten. She moved in shadow, a quiet hand slipping a scrap of paper into the pocket of a child's coat. A minute spent rearranging a stack of letters so that 2 would fall under the desk for late discovery. A conversation steered politely toward certain topics where she knew eyes would flash and tongues might slip. She never forced a thing. She coaxed. She made the house reveal itself slowly, like a reluctant witness, every night. When she returned to her attic, she opened a small, battered notebook she'd found in the trash one afternoon, a thin thing with a torn cover, the pages soft with age. It was the most dangerous thing she owned. In that book, she wrote down what she'd seen. Names, dates, snippets of conversations, small sketches of where things were kept. The act of writing steadied her hands. It made the swirl of anger and hurt into something useful. She dated each entry carefully, so nothing could be dismissed later as imagination. She wrote not with fury, but with the coolness of a woman cataloging evidence. She called it her ledger, though it was not about money. It was a record of truth, the truth they had the invisible. Each insult they made, each lie they told, found a place on those pages. She did not burn the pages. She kept them folded under the mattress where the housekeeper's cats would not sleep. It felt like burying bones with care, composting the past into the soil of something new. Sometimes she would invent small, harmless tests. She would place a cup slightly to the left and watch the master's hand correct it, even if no one had complained. She would leave tight threads untied and note who did not bother to fix them. She learned which friends of the family were thin-skinned for rumor and which could be pushed to question a story. She learned which neighbors loved gossip more than loyalty, and which servants carried silent grudges that could be turned, and there were. Conversations she captured by accident, a child, telling a friend in the garden about seeing Mummy with the man behind the greenhouse. The words tumbling out with the dangerous honesty of a child. She heard a sobbing maid from the stable speak of money taken and promises broken. She stole glances at ledgers when dusting and recognized the same handwriting and receipts she'd seen in the master's coat. Curiosity bloomed in the listeners. As the narrator would now say to you, what is she planning? The question hung in the air like perfume, but she never heard the answer. The plan had to be right. She refused the temptation to burn everything at once in a wild, emotional blaze. That would have been satisfying, yes, but messy and loud, and it would have left her with nothing but embers. Instead, she built a slow machine. She gathered proof in small, undeniable pieces. A letter hidden in the lining of a cushion here. A photograph slipped into a book there. Once, under the doormat, she found a receipt for a payment made to a man who did not exist at the company the master claimed he ran. The master's alarm at that moment, a slip of the eyebrow, a tightening of the jaw, told her the truth before any confession came. She made allies where she could. A stable boy with a soft heart earned a subtle nod from her as she replaced his broken bootstrap without comment. He began to whistle less and listen more. A neighbor's maid, tired of being stepped on herself, found a scrap and a safe word in the right moment. No banners were raised, but threads were pulled. All the while, she remained the same silhouette the family expected, quick with a broom, apologetic, never intrusive. The children still poked and teased her, the lady still scorned her shoes, and the master still pointed out mistakes. To the world, she was the obedient maid. To herself, she was the seamstress of fate, stitching together a pattern no one else could see. At times, her mind circled around the idea of confrontation. She imagined standing in the parlor and tossing the notebook across the table. She pictured the master's face when the ledger of his lies lay open for guests to see. The fantasy warmed her blood like a small fire, but she kept it tucked away where it could not be used prematurely. The plan depended on patience. It depended on timing and the slow erosion of the family's comfortable assumptions. She observed the rhythms of guests and dinner parties, when drunk laughter made truth slippery and when sober minds were sharp and cruel. She watched the seasons. She marked anniversaries, birthdays, when relatives came by with their own vulnerabilities and the household was brittle with pretense. She set small traps for truth to slip into. A guest's curiosity piqued when offered missing information. A servant's loyalty shifted when her kindness had been repaid. There were nights when the quiet was almost unbearable, when the temptation to act, to scream, to rip the curtain and show them the rot nearly overpowered her. She would sit by the attic window and stare at the frozen garden where footprints traced patterns in the crusted snow. She would press a hand over her chest and tell herself the story of patience. She would breathe slowly. She wrote another entry in the notebook. Her hand did not shake. The people of the house called her patient. They called her meek. They did not know that patience was a weapon she had learned to wield. It was not the brittle sort that breaks under weight. It was a deep, calculated strength, like the stillness before an ocean storm. Slow and relentless and gathering force. As her notebook filled, she began to see how the pieces could be arranged. A night when the master's business partners came for dinner. A time when the lady of the house would be inclined to boast to the wrong listener. A child who could be coaxed to blurt out a careless memory in front of the wrong guest. The plan was not a single blow, but a series of small, precise revelations, each one timed to unravel reputation and expose truth. She did not whisper her intentions to anyone. Revenge was not a thing to be shared. It was a private contract, a sacred promise to herself. Her ledger was her compass. Her patience, the engine dot when she finally closed the notebook and lay down to sleep, the attic colder than she'd like. Her breath was even. The pain of that public shame still throbbed, but it was now tempered by purpose. The house was full of their careless confidence, and that confidence was a fragile thing. She had learned where it cracked out soon, very soon, the cracks would become fractures. The family, who had thought themselves safe behind crystal chandeliers and polite smiles, did not yet suspect that the quiet maid who polished their silver was the one who had been polishing their undoing. She would not rush it. She would not show her hand until everything was in place, that her silence no longer felt like defeat. It felt like preparation, and beyond that quiet. In the rooms where secrets had been whispered and promises broken, something waited, patient, cold, and precise, ready to change everything. She was invisible in their eyes. But that night, she became unforgettable. The house glowed with chandeliers, the long dining table shining with silver and glass. Guests laughed, their voices rising in false cheer, while the master of the house bragged about honor and success. The lady smiled like a queen, dripping in velvet and jewels. Their children, spoiled and restless, darted between the guests like little shadows of cruelty. And through it all, she moved quietly, serving wine, clearing plates, ignored as always. No one thought to look at her twice. But she carried more than a tray that night. She carried their truth. When the master lifted his glass for a toast, to family, to honesty, to honor, his voice filled the hall. The words almost made her laugh. She stepped forward, calm, unhurried, and placed a folded envelope on the silver tray. Instead of giving it to him, she offered it to the guest seated beside him. The room stilled, curious, uneasy. The guest took the envelope, unfolded the page, and his eyes widened. "This," he whispered, glancing at the numbers scrawled across the page. "These accounts don't match. These are lies." Gasps spread like wildfire. Heads leaned in, whispers rose. The master's face turned red. "Nonsense," he barked, but his voice cracked, and in that crack, the truth leaked out. She did not look away. She raised her eyes, steady for the first time. "I was invisible in this house," she said softly. "But I heard. I saw. And I remembered." The room froze. Guests stared, mouths open. A maid was speaking, and not with apologies, but with power. From her apron pocket, she pulled more papers. A letter written in a lady's own hand, proving she had been sending money away in secret. A receipt tucked into the master's coat for a midnight meeting by the pier. Snippets of conversations, small details no one thought she noticed. Piece by piece, she laid them bare. Whispers grew louder. The lady's jeweled hand trembled as she tried to cover her face. The master's fists shook, his words turning to stammers. The children clung to each other, no longer mocking, no longer cruel, but frightened. The guests leaned forward, devouring every word. Their perfect family was unraveling, exposed by the very woman they had treated like dirt beneath their shoes. The room fell into a silence so heavy it was almost unbearable. Every eye was on her. Then she placed the final page on the table. A copy of the torn ledger, proof of lies too large to deny. "This is who you are," she said, her voice steady. "Every insult, every laugh, every cruelty, you built this moment yourselves. And tonight, the world sees you as I always did." The guests exchanged looks of disgust. Some pushed their chairs back quietly, excusing themselves, not wanting to be tied to the shame that now clung to the family. Others stayed only to watch, to whisper, to judge. The master shouted again, but no one listened. His voice no longer carried power. His name was ruined, his pride destroyed, and the maid they had mocked stood taller than ever. Her silence broken, her patience finally fulfilled. She did not scream. She did not strike. She simply revealed the truth, and that truth destroyed them more completely than any fury could. The room that once laughed at her now bowed under her words. She turned from the table slowly, calmly, and walked out into the night air. For the first time in her life, she did not feel like a shadow. She felt weightless, free Dot, and as the door closed behind her, the house remained in silence, its proud masters left broken, pale, and powerless. She had been nothing to them, but after that night, she was unforgettable. The night of her revelation did not end with shouting or chaos. It ended with silence. The kind of silence that follows a storm so violent, so unforgiving, that nothing dares to move after. The house, once bursting with laughter and polished arrogance, now stood like a hollow shell. The master sat stiff in his chair, his face drained of its thunder. The lady's jewels sparkled mockingly against her tears. Their children, for the first time, huddled together in quiet fear, realizing the parents they thought untouchable were not gods but clay-cracked, fragile, and collapsing Dot when the last guest slipped away. Murmuring behind a gloved hand, the family was left alone with their shame. The chandeliers still glowed, but the light seemed harsh, unkind, illuminating every crease of humiliation carved into their faces. Their voices were gone. Their laughter, their cruelty, their superiority, all gone. What remained was silence, heavy and suffocating, a silence they could not command because it belonged to her now, and she stood at the doorway, her back straight, her gaze steady. For years, they had forced her to bow her head, to keep her eyes on the floor, to swallow her words. But tonight, her eyes were level. She had spoken, she had exposed, and she had won. She left the house without a word, her steps unhurried, her shoes clicking softly against the marble floor they once made her scrub until her hands bled. The winter air outside bit at her cheeks, but it felt sharp with freedom, not with pain. For the first time, the cold did not chill her heart. It cleared it. The house behind her did not feel grand anymore. It loomed like a carcass of pride, gutted by truth. Its windows glowed faintly, but inside, she knew no laughter remained. Only shame. That was her justice, not their destruction by hand, but by truth. They had dug their own grave with arrogance. She had simply shown the world the hole they were standing in. In the days that followed, whispers spread faster than fire in dry grass. Neighbors who once praised the family's wealth now spoke with lowered voices. "Did you hear?" they said. "All those years? Lies." Their friends, the ones who toasted with them, now avoided their company, unwilling to be stained by scandal. The master's business partners pulled away, creditors came calling, and doors that had always opened wide for them suddenly slammed shut. And at the center of those whispers was her. The maid who had been mocked as invisible was suddenly unforgettable. People looked at her differently now, some with respect, some with guilt, some with awe. For those who had laughed along with the family, her quiet eyes became a mirror they couldn't face. For those who had known hardship themselves, she became something else entirely, a symbol. Proof that even the smallest voice, the most overlooked person, could change everything. But she did not linger among the gossip. She did not bask in her new shadow of fame. She walked her path quietly, as she always had. The difference now was that her head was high, her shoulders no longer bent. The chains of humiliation had fallen, and in their place was dignity. At night, when she lay in her tiny attic room for the last time, she wept not from pain, but from release. The tears were soft, cleansing. She whispered prayers, but they were no longer pleas for strength or rescue. They were prayers of thanks. "You heard me," she murmured into the silence. "You saw me." Her prayers had always been seeds, sown in silence and watered with her tears. And now, they had bloomed into justice. She was not broken. She was not defeated. She was free. The house, stripped of its illusions, grew emptier with each passing day. The lady no longer hosted her glittering dinners. The master no longer roared with confidence. The children no longer mocked. The grand halls echoed with absence. Wealth could be rebuilt, reputations could be mended, but pride once shattered could never be restored. That was her true revenge. Not that they had lost money, not that their friends abandoned them, but that they could never again look at themselves in the mirror without seeing her. Face the maid they had tried to erase standing tall in there, ruined Dot, and as she finally packed her few belongings and left that attic room behind, she paused at the doorway one last time. She let her hand rest against the frame, rough from years of scrubbing and cleaning. Hands that had been mocked as nothing but tools. She smiled, soft but certain, because those same hands that once scrubbed their floors had written the story of their downfall. Dot. She stepped into the world beyond their gates, not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as a woman who had turned her pain into power. The snow crunched beneath her feet, the night sky wide above her. The world was still cold, still cruel, but she was no longer afraid of it. She walked away free. And behind her, the house that once silenced her stood like a monument to arrogance destroyed, its walls holding a silence that would never end. She was no longer invisible. She was unforgettable. Isn't it strange? Those who believe they hold all the power often forget about the ones they step on. They sit at their tables of pride, laugh in their circles of wealth, and mock the ones who serve them as though they are shadows. But shadows have memory. Shadows watch. And one day, when the time is right, those shadows can become the very light that exposes everything. This story reminds us of something so simple, yet so often ignored. Never underestimate the silent, the humble, the ones who bow their heads and keep working. Their silence does not mean weakness. Their patience is not emptiness. Every cruel word, every careless act, every wound you leave behind, those things are remembered. They settle deep, and one day, they rise again as justice. Dot. She was just the maid. That's what they thought. Just a pair of hands to scrub their floors. Just a figure to mock when they needed to feel bigger. They didn't see her tears at night. They didn't hear her prayers whispered into the darkness. They didn't imagine that the very person they dismissed would hold their secrets in her hands. They didn't believe her silence had power, but silence can be louder than thunder when it finally breaks. Her patience became her strength, and her strength became their downfall. The very woman they tried to erase became the one they could never escape. The lesson is clear. Respect every person. You may not know the battles they carry quietly, the truths they hold inside, the fire that burns behind their silence. Kindness costs nothing, but cruelty can cost you everything. And justice, though it may be slow, is certain. She was the maid, yes, but she was also the witness, the listener, the memory they couldn't control. And in the end, she became the storyteller of their ruined Dot. So let this stay with you. Never underestimate those who seem powerless. Never think your pride makes you untouchable. And never forget that every heart, even the humblest one, holds untold strength. She was just the maid, but in the end, she was the one they would never forget. Thank you for listening to this story. If it moved you, if you believe every act of betrayal deserves justice, then join us. Subscribe to Payback Stories for more tales where the humble rise, the cruel fall, and the silent voices finally speak. Because every shadow has a story, and every story has its justice.